Hey, this is Elektron, and today I'm going to show you how to master your tracks nicely with Logic plugins. And then I'll show you a little extra thing that you can do with a couple free plugins that are easy to get on the internet, which you can also apply to your master just to help it out a little bit. Basically I have a track here, looks like this, and yes, I do try to master on the track. I don't bounce out an unmastered track and then master it unless I'm mastering for somebody else. Then in that case I have to master an unmastered audio file or wave file. But in my case, when I'm mastering my own tracks, I just master on the master chain. That way when I have some mastering plugins on my master chain or my master fader, I can mix into those plugins to make the master sound better. So a couple things before I apply these plugins. Of course, I do want to let you know that whatever your track sounds like unmastered, mastering isn't going to make that track sound better. It's just going to make your track sound louder. That's it. Of course, when you get into more technical things, you can add saturation, fatteners, whatever kind of distortions to fatten your master fader up. But if the mix doesn't sound good, mastering will never ever fix a shitty mix. So you want to get your mix sounding as perfect as possible before you rely on mastering for that extra touch, because it's just not going to change anything. And so many people say mastering's so super important. It's not. Mixing's important. So if you are in that stage where you're trying to figure out how to make mix sound perfect, like certain parts of your song sound really, really loud, certain parts sound, subtle and nice and smooth, you might want to learn mixing. But for mastering, in this video, I'm going to show you how to do it. So I'm going to play this track here, or at least the loud part of this track, which is my drop. That's the part you tend to want to focus on when you're mastering, which is right here. And of course there's more quiet parts of the track, which is over here and right here. And of course there's the breakdown here, and then another drop here, and I have a further drop here. And the biggest parts with every element and a full EQ spectrum are where I want to focus on when I'm mastering. But to do this with Logic, what I would recommend, I've done a video on this in the past, but I've used the multipressor, and I actually don't use a multipressor on my masters anymore. I would rather multi-exciter or multi-saturator, multi-band saturator. But I actually use compressors, just like a normal bus compressor. And the most fun part about this is cycling through, so we're using the Logic compressor here. What I would do is I would zero this out, and yes, it's going to be the first plugin that I add here. So the first thing I'm going to add is a compressor, and then I'm going to work up this threshold and ratio until I get a nice compression going here, and my release is going to be somewhere around 15 milliseconds. Logic by default actually has a pretty good attack and release default setting. I heard somebody say before that they weren't, but they actually are. There's nothing wrong with a 15 millisecond attack, 15 millisecond release. You don't want these to be less than that, and if they're more than that, you have to understand why they are more than that. But these are good default settings. So have your attacks and your release at 15 milliseconds, and then work your threshold up and your ratio up until they start working. So if I go ahead, I look at this graph here, I'm going to click on graph. I can see my kick and my snare are sticking out. So this is something that I actually like. This is a situation where I would actually go back into the mix and turn my drums down a little bit, because you see those big sharp transients there that are sticking well above the mix by almost, looks like at least 6 decibels based on this meter. I wouldn't want them sticking out that far, so yeah, go back into the mix, which is why I like mastering on the project and mixing into a graph like this, so I could turn my snare and my kick down a little bit just to get them more even on the mix, so when I compress the master, I won't over compress the drums. Since they're sticking out so far, they are going to hit the threshold before everything else, and it's going to sound bad. Or it could sound bad. It doesn't mean it's going to sound bad. It just means that it could sound bad. They could sound a little bit overpressed. So yeah, I'd go back into the mix and fix those, but since this is mastering, I'm not going to do that. So let's, whoa, that just got loud. Yeah, so the volume might be bouncing around quite a bit in this video. I apologize for that. Let's go to a nice ratio of 2, just for something subtle. You don't want to do too much compression on the mesh. You really don't want to overdo it, and you don't want to underdo it either. See, that kick is just bouncing this pin around. I would never have that, but when I'm compressing, I want a nice consistent, like, I want this pin to hit 0, you know, periodically hit 0, but I also want it to not sit on 0. If it's sitting on 0 too much, it probably means not enough peaks are getting pressed. I want the every single peak that needs to get pressed, and as soon as this pin settles down and stops moving, there's probably not enough compression there. But if the pin is stuck up, that probably means you're over compressing. So if my pin like stops here and like maybe goes, its range is like from here to here, and it really doesn't go below that, then I'm over compressed. So this is looks like a nice compression. My pin is a little bit like, you know, it's probably on this mark right here. It hits the it hits 0 sometimes, and definitely looks like it has its fair share of compression going on up here. And another way you can kind of deal with compressing is listening. Does it sound overpressed? That's what you're going to listen for, because it's hard to tell sometimes if something's nicely compressed. It is truly hard to hear that. It sounds like a glue sound. It sounds like you're gluing every layer together when you compress the master. But if you're using minimal resources, and if you have not been doing this for that long, it's going to be really, really hard to hear compression. So what I would say is try to focus on listening for over compression and then work your way down. And a nice way to save yourself from over compressing is not to run this ratio all the way like too high. So I would say keep it on 2 and try to compress from there. And try to just make sure this pin isn't too crazy. If your pin is going from here to over here to back up to 10 back, you know, that's probably going to be a little too crazy. You want this pin just to move like in this area. You don't want it to be like hovering around 10 for too long. That'll be probably a little too much. If it's stuck on 5, not really moving, then move it down. But this pin, you want it to do its thing and then come back to 0, do its thing. So then we can move over to a different section of the track and see what's going on with this compression here. So what I would do is I would try to move this up just to get a little bit more compression on these other parts of the track. And obviously you can get the smallest amount of compression you can get while it sounds good, like with it sounding good, is always I think the best setting you can have. But compression is just one of those hard things to explain. You gotta hear what it does, and of course when you're using a bus compressor on the master, your mix has to be good as well, or else you're gonna crush some nice elements of your track. So there's not much going on in the intro there, not much going on here. Yeah, so my kick is getting pressed a little hard, but that's all right. That's something I could fix in the mix. But yeah, if you like see what I'm talking about, every time the kick hits, this pin jumps. So I would turn that kick down just a little bit, or I would distort it, try to even it out some way. But yeah, when this drop comes, I want that compressor to be doing the most work. So that looks good for now. And then what I like to do, this is something that I've adopted recently. I like to get another compressor. What was I using with that black one? I like to get another compressor with a really slow release, and this one I like this barely moving. Yes, I love compressing 2 times. It's just the coolest thing in the world. So I like to get a nice slow release on this one. I like using virtual analog, like of old-fashioned compressor emulations, which have like a really slow natural release. They don't. Some of them don't even have release knobs like the one I use. I use a Fairchild emulation, and it has a really slow release, and I like throwing that one as my second compressor in charge. But this one's going to work really subtly. Let's get this one. See, just like that, barely working, just like that. And so you have a nice compressor working really strong, and then you have the second compressor working subtly, and it gives a nice rounded out smooth sound. Coolest thing when you can hear what that's doing. It sounds so cool. So the next thing we're going to add is a limiter. We can use the regular limiter or the adaptive limiter. I've noticed the adaptive limiter gets louder, but you'll have to fight off the distortion. This limiter does not really give you much distortion at all, but I don't really like the limiting of this because I have trouble getting a really loud volume with this limiter, especially like when I'm comparing to a track. So one thing I forgot to mention is when you're mastering, have a reference track that you're comparing to constantly. You want to be comparing to professional tracks the entire time you're doing this. So if I was mastering this track for real right now, everything like when I'm at the limiting stage and the mixing stage, of course, I'm constantly bouncing back and forth from my track to my favorite track released by a professional to try to get my levels the same. So I might listen to Stone Bank ripped to pieces while I'm mixing this, and I'll say, okay, his song has way more bass than mine, or his song has way less bass than mine, so I'll turn my bass down, or his song's louder than mine, so I'll go ahead, turn my limiter up, or his song sounds quieter than mine, so I'll turn my limiter down. And you could go on forever asking yourself those questions, but always be comparing to your favorite tracks, because you can't just blindly master. I think it's impossible. I've tried it plenty of times. Let's go with this limiter first, and I'll show you how to use this. So this is just the limiter. It's not the adaptive limiter. And I'll mention again, I have trouble getting a true loudness with this limiter, but that could just be something I'm doing wrong. Or that could just be normal. This limiter could be set to just make your tracks limited perfectly instead of too loud. So what you do with this limiter is you want to come to this output level, and you want to just stop it at -0.1 or -0.2 or 3. When I do this, I usually have it at -0.3 or 2, not 0.1, because that's just too close to the top. So what this is referring to is right here. So do you see this 0 here? Well, -0.1 would be right under that 0 down there, or -0.2. Right here, -0.3 would be this 3 right here. Or no, it actually wouldn't. That's 3. So that would be -3. So yeah, -0.2 or 0.3 would be right below that 0. And so it's going to, that's basically a ceiling, and it will stop your levels from going past that. Here's another thing. Some limiters have trouble actually limiting, which means some transients will leak through. I have this issue with the Fab Filter limiter, and I don't know why. it doesn't have a true peak detection, so you want to make sure this is always on so your peaks do not get out of that ceiling. You want the ceiling to block everything. The release, I never touched that. Look ahead, I never touched that. When I'm using this limiter, I just set my ceiling and then watch this. Make sure you keep track of your volumes, because I think this volume is going to get louder for you unless I somehow magically fix this in the editing of this video. So what's going on now is my kick, I can already hear that getting pounded into the ceiling, and it's really getting destroyed by these mastering plugins. So that, again, I really would have to fix that kick, so I'd have to actually underlimit the entire track just to make that kick sound nice. But what I would do is I would push this limiter until my levels are pretty consistently staying around that negative 0.3 point. See, there's that negative 0.3. We have negative 0.2 here, but it looks like it's limiting us at negative 0.3. And you want your levels to be pretty consistently hanging around here. You don't want them to be glued to the ceiling. You don't want them to be not moving, but you also don't want them to be bouncing around. So that looks like a leveling that I would have on a track that I would professionally release. I would not, like, there's nothing wrong with what these levels are doing here. To give you an idea of what you wouldn't want, let me try to max this out. That's a lot of limiting. So this yellow here, I want you to look at this yellow. That's a lot of limiting. Look, that's 15 decibels of gain reduction, I think. Yeah, because then there's, yeah, shit tells me the reduction right here. So 15 decibels of reduction, that's how much shit is being chopped off of your sound. And that's not good. You don't want that much stuff getting chopped off of your sound. So when you're limiting, you only want to be limiting the smallest bit. So it looks like now it's okay to have some of your percussion getting chopped here. So it looks like every time my kick and my snare hit that they are getting chopped tremendously. It looks like 5 decibels is being taken off of each of those. So look, I want you to look at the yellow levels here every time a kick and a snare hits. And that's alright. That's like what I would use a limiter for, to like limit those big percussion. So my kick and my snare are too loud, so limiting them probably isn't a bad idea. Running them into the limiter isn't a bad idea. And of course, I wouldn't want those yellow kind of meters there to be showing up when you're just hearing like the melody or something, because then you're chopping off some valuable artifacts of your melody, and you of course don't want that. You're going to lose some bit of your track by pushing too much of it into a limiter. But that's how you make your song loud, is with a limiter. And then compressing it is how you would make your song compressed, your master compressed. And one last thing I wanted to mention. So these are all you really need to make your song loud and technically master it. But you also should throw an EQ on there, of course, to touch up the low cut, that 30 hertz low cut, if you're into that, and you're going to play your song loud. And whatever you would need to dip, or I would never add anything on this EQ. Adding stuff sounds really bad, especially on the master. But if you have to take anything out, like a strong peak or anything like that, so if I play this, I always like to dip the mids just a tad, because I tend to mix my mids loud. That's what I've learned about myself. So I always dip the mids a little bit, and everything you do here should be subtle. You definitely don't want to do too much in this EQ. You should really, I think you should EQ in the mix. That's why I say an EQ is not 100% necessary on the master, but again, you could always just use the EQ on the master because that's general practice. But another thing I wanted to mention is that if you've ever heard of OTT, that's always something fun to use on the master. It's a free plugin, but of course, you cannot use too much OTT on the master or else you will overdo it. So when I use OTT on the master, I work it up and I only use a little bit. Just use a tiny bit of that OTT touch. You don't want to use too much of it because this depth knob here is so powerful. You can use just like 10% of it and get a nice, valuable multiband compression. Also, a free plugin that I like to use to mess around with is Camel Crusher. And the way you would use this, again, zero it out and use the distortion to get that nice saturation, but only a little bit. You don't need a lot of this stuff. And then the compressor you don't need because we've already compressed, and you would do it like that. There you go, guys. That is how you would master with Logic plugins and a couple of free plugins that you can easily find on the internet. If you took any value from this video, go ahead, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate that. My name's Alex Rome, and stay tuned for some more awesome stuff.